kind of glad Jim's not here today, because he's spent the last 5 years that he's been with us trying to get us to think about a God who is not a being, a thing, something out there or up there or down here or anywhere like that, to think about God in different ways. And then this passage that Penny read is really clear. God has a voice. God can talk to Moses. God has a face. Moses can ask to see God's face. God has a hand, a very big hand that's so big that when Moses gets into a cleft in the rock, God can completely cover Moses up. I mean, I think King Kong would be jealous. That's a huge hand. How can you have that kind of description for God and not God be a being of some kind? Not have God look like something. I mean, we read that story. God doesn't look like anything. But that looks like something. The reason is pretty simple. They didn't have, in the days when they wrote that story, they didn't have any abstract words in their language. We talk about God's presence. That's an abstract idea. We talk about the essence of God. That's an abstract idea. We talk about the Holy Spirit. That's an abstract idea. You can go through the whole of the Old Testament, well, with maybe just a couple of minor exceptions, and you will never find the words for the Holy Spirit. They didn't know how to say it. Even in the New Testament, when they talked about the Holy Spirit coming to Jesus, they didn't talk about it in abstract terms. They had to imagine a dove coming down out of heaven. Because the only way they could express two words that we writers use all the time, they had to express abstract ideas with concrete words. The closest they could come to talking about spirit was to talk about wind or breath. When a person died and the person's spirit left them, it was when they no longer breathed. When they wanted to talk about having a physical body, a body of life, they had to use the word for blood. Because when blood ceases to flow, there's no life left. And so when they were trying to talk about the sense of God being there, they had no choice but to use some personal expressions. I mean, here's God, who's got a voice, who's got a face that Moses wants to see, who covers up Moses on the hillside so that Moses will not be struck dead by the presence of God. And then, after God has gone by, God removes God's hand, and Moses gets to see God's backside. I love that image. I like to think sometimes that God mooned Moses. Anybody who doesn't know what mooning is? Wave a hand if you don't. Our son was at a camp for handicapped kids, and the newspapers in Toronto suddenly discovered this. The newspapers and TV stations suddenly discovered this, and they thought, wow, this would be a heart-touching story. We'll show a picture of all these kids who otherwise don't have a decent life, but they're at camp together. We'll do a video of it. So they organized all the kids to get out into the playground, and the plane went by circling with the video cameras going. And our son got some of his friends together, and as the plane went over, they turned around and went. That's mooning. Did God do that? Kim McMillan, who was the presbytery officer for this area, said something to me a few years back that I think is really important. He said, I have a personal relationship with something that isn't a person. Think about that one a little bit. I have a personal relationship with something that isn't a person. See, it's hard to have a personal relationship with a pillar of fire and a column of smoke. And what Moses wanted was that personal relationship with the God who was leading them through the desert. Isn't that what we all want, a personal relationship? Isn't that why we get married? Isn't that why we have special friends? Isn't that why you gather with your granddaughters? Isn't that why we have school reunions and professional groups that gather? So that we can have a personal relationship with those people. My graduating class, I know they're out there. But they're just an abstract notion unless I get together with them once in a while. And sometimes we talk about the old days, and sometimes we talk about the current days. But we start to build that personal relationship. And so Moses said to God, let me see you face to face. Moses did not say, I want to admire your butt. I guess God didn't wear a Lululemon. Moses wanted to have a personal relationship. The point, in case I'm leading you astray, is not whether God has hands or a face or a butt or anything else. The point in this story is that God was ahead of Moses. If we're going to see anything of God, all we can see is God's backside, because God is always out there ahead of us. You notice when we were singing Like a Rock, we said, God, like the sun on the horizon. I'm in the middle, sorry, I've lost it.
God is ever before.
Yeah, God is ever before. God is ever before, like the sun on the horizon. You're always looking ahead to God as you move on. John, you may have noticed that your favorite hymn does not say backward, Christian soldiers. It says onward, Christian soldiers. Move on, keep on going. God never, never, never says go backward. You can go all through the scriptures and never find God calling people back to what they were. It's always calling people ahead to what they could be, to what they should be. God doesn't say go back to the kind of organizations that we had 40 years ago. God doesn't say go back to the songs we used to sing. God doesn't say go back to the prayers we used to pray. God says, come, follow me into the future. We sometimes joke that there's no such thing as an undo button for life. You can't rewind, you can't go back. And God doesn't ask us to. God says, I'm out ahead of you. Look, you can see me there. The trouble, of course, is that we don't often recognize God ahead of us. We recognize God only when we look back into our time and see that God was there in that special moment, in what we've learned here to call God moments. And so we think that God is back there. God wasn't. God was present at that moment, and God is now out here. The God moments, have you noticed, they're always something that was before, that happened before. I've yet to see somebody take that microphone and say, I think I'm having a God moment right now. It's out ahead that God is ahead and waiting for us. One of Marshall McLuhan's aphorisms was that we drive into the future staring into our rearview mirrors. Joan and I did that on Wednesday coming back up from Vancouver. We had one of those rainstorms where the creation story was reversed. One of the things that the creation story is that God separated the waters above from the waters below. On Wednesday, the waters above and the waters below were one lot, and they all hit our windshield. But amazingly enough, there was no water on our rearview mirrors because we were driving ahead into the rain and it wasn't hitting the mirrors. I could look into my rearview mirror and see clearly down the highway. I couldn't see clearly up the highway because of the rain and the windshield wipers going. And so we look back and we think we see God in our rearview mirrors. It's what somebody calls the 20/20 vision of hindsight. We recognize God back there. And we think about maybe how God nudged the steering wheel of our lives, how God sent us on a slightly different path, how our lives have changed as a result of those events. Sometimes they've been tragedies. Sometimes they've been celebrations. And we've asked, why does this have to happen to me? Why does this have to happen to her, to him? It's just not fair. And then later, you look at it and you say, I'm a better person because of this. I've learned something about the human condition. I've learned something about appreciating how others feel. I can have empathy for them. What Moses had in the desert, I think we would call a God moment. Let's not read it literally into thinking of God as a person. Remember what Kim said. I have a personal relationship with something that isn't a person. It's the personal relationship that matters, not what it is that you have the relationship with. God is always ahead of us. God never calls us backwards. God is not back there. God is ahead of us. Where we're going, we try to catch up with God.